So for an end of the year video, I wanted to do something a little bit different, something that I have wanted to do for a while, but have just never had the chance or never had the materials to actually try out, and that's hardware videos, because there's a cat, because I watch that kind of stuff a lot, and it's always something that I wanted to try myself. Now that it's after Christmas, I actually have something to show you guys. So for Christmas, I ended up making myself a Raspberry Pi powered emulation machine, because it's something that I've sort of wanted for a while, and I kind of ummed and ahed on different ways to actually do it, different ways to make something like that, you know, modifying a PSP or figuring out how an Arduino works and stuff like that. But eventually I decided on a Raspberry Pi 3B Plus, because that seemed to be one of the most stable and most well understood ways to actually do something like this. And I had a couple of criteria when I was making it, because I didn't want to just make an emulation machine, I wanted to make a portable emulation machine, something that I could actually just carry around, and I didn't necessarily have to have under a TV connected to an HDMI at all times. Because of course a Raspberry Pi is very good at that. It has an HDMI out on it, and you can connect it to pretty much anything that has the right ports. But I wanted something that was sort of self-contained, something that, like this, has its own controls and its own screen attached, so that I wouldn't have to worry about that unless I specifically wanted to route it to like a screen for larger reasons, you know, like a party game or something. So I also had a couple of extra criteria that I don't have a soldering iron, so I couldn't just buy a loose screen and actually connect it to a board, because I don't have the materials to do that right now. So I needed something that was kind of like a bespoke unit, something that was already at least partially put together, so that I could finish the job myself and add the Raspberry Pi as its heart. And what I ended up getting was this. This is by a company called Waveshare. I should probably mention, if it's not obvious, that I'm not sponsored for this video or anything. There are cats yelling at me. And I have no affiliation with any of these companies or anything like that, but it was just the kind of thing that you stumble upon and you realize there's like this whole world of stuff to try out, and that's what I have here. So this is called the GamePi 43. Probably because it sort of looks like a Game Boy. I mean, you can kind of tell it looks very much like a Game Boy, but with extra buttons. I'll show you an actual closer shot a little bit later in better focus. But this pretty much checked all of the marks. Waveshare has several different portable Pi cases that have their own screen that's already added. The two main ones that I've seen are the Game Hat, which looks a lot like a PSP but really thick, it's like this thick, and the GamePi 43, this one here. And the Game Hat is pretty nice. I like the form factor of it, but the main thing that I didn't like about it, so I actually went with this one instead, was it has an analog stick instead of a D-pad. And now obviously I would rather have both, like one of each, so that I could emulate many different things without needing to plug in a controller. But if I had to choose one to use and have the other only usable when I plug in a controller, I would rather have a D-pad than an analog stick, because I'm going to be playing a lot of like Game Boy Advance stuff, DS stuff, Super Nintendo stuff, you know, things like that, that I would much rather have a D-pad to actually play in a portable sort of form factor. So I ended up going with this, and I'll go ahead and put actually the links in the description below this video to some of the resources that I used to actually build this thing. I'll link you to the Waveshare page for this particular machine, and you can sort of navigate from there. And I'll also provide you with a link to the Amazon page of the kit that I used from CanaKit, because you of course have to have a Raspberry Pi and several things along with it, that's backwards, to actually use. So as a sort of general overview as to how this works, these come pre-assembled with the screen, but the rest of it is in pieces. So all the side panels, the back panel, everything like that is off, and you have to of course put in the Raspberry Pi itself and then assemble the rest of the shell around it. And so you will need not only one of these as a case to actually build something like this if you wanted to, but you'll also need the Raspberry Pi itself. You will need a power supply for the Raspberry Pi to actually get it working at first. Probably a keyboard would be a good idea, because you won't actually have it seated in this at first. You'll need to set it up with the actual software and everything to get it working, and you will need a keyboard for that. And you'll also need an SD card, because of course the Raspberry Pi does not have any kind of integrated hard drive. You will need an SD card to act as its memory. So the kits that I'm going to link you to are a really good source for that, because not only is CanaKit a authorized Raspberry Pi official reseller, so that you know you're actually getting legit stuff and not like weird kind of iffy electronics, but they're also just really not particularly expensive. So this is a really good project for those of you who just want to try something like this. If you've ever thought about making an emulation machine or like a Raspberry Pi powered anything, and you've just never actually like pulled the trigger before and bought something to try, this is a really good start, because these sort of like hobbyist kits are really affordable, and they're not that difficult to actually put together and to get working. A Raspberry Pi does, of course, require some technological know-how to get working, but it's not the most complicated thing in the world, and if you've never done anything like this before, don't let the sort of hobbyist electronic scene nature of the whole thing scare you away. It is something that is very much worth just sort of diving into and seeing what happens, because you can make some really fun little things with it, and I'm going to show you now in just a second the detail on the actual emulation machine itself and everything that it does. There are a couple of things that you have to learn, admittedly, when it comes to creating a machine like this. For instance, I've never used any sort of Linux operating system based anything before, so I'm kind of having to learn like Linux commands and Linux syntax from scratch because I've never done it before. One thing that I've learned as a little tip to give everyone out there is Linux is a case-sensitive operating system. So if you have something like Windows and you're used to how Windows works, man, he's really wanting attention, you will know that if you have like a program looking for a specific folder or a specific file, as long as the name is correct, it will find it. In Linux, however, not only does the name have to be the same, but the case has to be the same. So if it is in all caps and the file that it's looking for is exactly the same name, but in all lowercase, you're going to have to rename the file because it's not going to find it otherwise. So these are just like the little kind of somewhat annoying aspects of learning a whole new sort of operating system that you'll have to deal with, but it's really not the hardest thing in the world, and it's something that is very much worth trying. So let's go over there and I'll actually show you in greater detail how all this works. So as for the actual case itself, it's actually a pretty nice little construction here. Like I mentioned, it does come completely disassembled save for the screen and the main circuit board on the inside actually being integrated into it already. The rest of it you have to screw together because of course you have to put the Raspberry Pi itself in there, so that would be very difficult otherwise. The case has some pretty neat little features. For one, it uses this, the screen itself here uses the HDMI port on the top of the Raspberry Pi, and there's this little bitty thing. It's like a little double-ended HDMI like input-output little bridge connected to this small card. And it's actually on the top. You can't actually see it, of course, but it's right about here, and it allows you to connect the HDMI out of the Pi to the HDMI in that's integrated on the circuit board behind this screen. And it sort of just uses that as the main output for the screen, which is nice. The buttons are pretty good, I will say. It comes with some extra buttons of various kinds, and they're kind of squishy, but they're not super loud and clicky for the most part, and they don't get stuck or anything like that. They're effective buttons. If I did have a couple of complaints for the case, though, one of them would be the buttons. I should go ahead and mention the D-pad, as you may be able to tell just from looking at it, is a little bit stiff. It's not a bad D-pad by any means. It's functional is probably what I would call it. It does its job, and it is just a little stiff. You have to press kind of hard. It does actually, I think, look a little bit worse than it is, because just by looking at it, it kind of looks like it has sort of sharp edges that are going to like dig into your thumb if you're doing any kind of like fighting game style like motions, but it actually doesn't. It actually rolls fairly smoothly, and in fact, in my opinion, that's actually the best way to use the D-pad when you're like using it for walking or anything like that, and say like a Game Boy Advance game. Instead of actually pressing here and then pressing here, it's actually more effective to just roll your hand like that and never actually let your thumb leave it. It makes the stiffness feel a lot less stiff. A lot of the stiffness actually does kind of alleviate itself over time as you use it, but it is a little stiffer than I would like. But like I said, it does the job. And the other buttons are actually back here. It has an L and R button. These are not that great. They are, again, very much like the D-pad, functional. They do their job, but they're not super spectacular or anything like that. If you think of other like handheld systems that have had shoulder buttons, say like the PSP's kind of hinging buttons, or the Game Boy Advance SP's like very light clicky buttons, they're nothing like that. All these actually are, if I can find one, are these little guys right here. Focus. These are momentary contact switches. Very basic, just kind of you press them down and they click. That's basically all they are. So they give you these little nubs to put on top of them. That way it's not just like a solid metal top. It's actually very grippy and nice. So these do feel pretty good. You just glue them on there. And they're pretty loud, as you can probably hear. Again, functional, they do the job, but for some things, maybe, especially if you're going into later stage games, like say the PS1, I would use a controller. Although, of course, and a lot of PS1 games you're probably going to want to plug in a controller anyway. One of the best parts of this case is the screen. The screen is very, very nice. It is an excellent 4.3-inch IPS screen at 800 by 480 resolution, which is fantastic. It is a really, really solid screen. The color reproduction is excellent. And of course, because it's an IPS screen, the viewing angle is fantastic too. It doesn't really matter what angle you look at it through, the colors are still nice and vibrant and don't darken or distort. It is a fantastic screen. It is definitely the highest point, the best part of this actual machine. And as far as the case goes, honestly, I think it's worth it just for the screen. The case also has a couple of extra features here. It has this nice little battery meter that gives you 25% increments on the batteries, and we'll get to the batteries in a minute because it's a really important, very, very nice part of the case. On the side here, you of course have access to all of the ports of the Raspberry Pi, the Ethernet port and all 4 USB ports. It might not seem like a big deal to have access to all 4 of these, but in my opinion it's actually a nice thing because for some reason I've noticed that some like thinner, more portable style cases actually block some of these sometimes. I've seen them block these bottom 2, so you only have access to ports 1 and 3, and these are only like half visible and thus you can't actually use them. I'm not sure why they decide to do that. That seems like the kind of thing that you would not want to compromise on, but there they are. So you do have access to all of these. Very important because, of course, for some higher level emulation, and of course this is a Raspberry Pi 3B+, so it does do more advanced emulation, you will want to plug in a controller for certain things. And you can just have this on your lap. It's a plenty big enough screen for you to see, and just plug in a controller and off you go. And of course you can use these for keyboards if you want to emulate something like DOSBox or an older computer, even like Atari 8-bits and things like that. This will do that. And you have your memory card here, your actual flash card. And the thing about this is the SD card slot on the actual Raspberry Pi itself is actually set in a little bit. It's about like here-ish, and obviously that is not going to reach there. So the case comes with this little bitty, almost like a daughter board, like we're going back to the DOS days, this little bitty sort of header thing that you plug in to the SD card slot, and it acts like a small extension. It has its own SD card slot on the end of it, and it fits just perfectly to make sure the card is flush to the case here. It being flush to the case is both good and bad. It's good because that means you can't snap it off. Some cases do have a problem with that. You have to really be careful when you disassemble or take out the Pi or anything like that. You need to take out the card too, because it sticks out on the side of the case just enough, good lord cat, in order to make it a danger of snapping it in half. This is perfectly flush, so you don't have to worry about hitting it against anything or anything like that and breaking it, which is of course very good for a portable case. The downside to this is it's flush, so you can't grab it. You need to either take off this side panel to get the card out, or just use some tweezers. Just take some tweezers, stick them to that little ridge where you would normally put your fingernail, and it pulls right out. It's fine. I think that's a plenty fine compromise for having it be flush like this and not have to worry about it being hit by anything and damaged. You also have some controls down here on the bottom. It does have its own integrated speaker, right there. More on that in just a second. So you have volume controls for it, and of course a backlight. You have backlight controls because this is a backlit screen, and it gets extremely bright, like way too bright, which I like. It actually ships, at least it ships to me, at about 70% brightness, and it can go all the way down to like very, very dark, but still easily visible in darker light, so you don't have to strain your eyes or anything, and of course it saves battery to do that as well. So it's a really nice screen, honestly. I really, really like the brightness slider here. It is very effective in terms of actually making sure, there we go, that you don't have to use more battery than you need or strain your eyes, and of course it still gets plenty bright enough to be able to see, for instance, outside if you're playing it in a park or something like that. The other aspect that I mentioned, this speaker. The speaker is kind of a hit and miss. It's the other kind of negative aspect that I have to say about the case. The speaker is not that great. I actually knew this before I bought it because, well, for the most part, when I play this, I'm going to be using the headphone jack up here. I'm going to be bypassing that speaker entirely, so it's not really a big deal to me. But there is like one other review of this thing that I've seen online, and they did mention that the speaker is not great. And I have to agree with that. It is not a fantastic speaker. It's actually better than I thought it would be by reading the description, the review that guy made. It doesn't sound cheap and tinny, which is kind of what I thought it would sound like. It just kind of sounds like you're underwater, or like you're playing in a tunnel. It has like this sort of reverberation or like echo effect, like you're playing kind of far away or through a wall or something like that. It actually still sounds okay, but it's definitely not an excellent speaker. And if you're like me and your sound is, you're pretty picky about your sound, then I would use the headphone jack, which is of course easily accessible right there if it will focus. The other aspect of this that is really positive are the batteries. I've seen some mobile cases like this that use AA batteries in order to power it, which is okay, but those aren't going to last for too long with something as powerful as a Pi 3. Those cases are usually meant for the Pi Zero, which has a bit of a less power draw. And that is also kind of sucky because of course you're going to have to replace them. You're going to have to throw them away and buy new ones. This case, however, uses these guys right here. It uses 18650s. Which is excellent. If you're not familiar with 18650s, they are lithium cells, they are fully rechargeable, and you can get them in all kinds of different capacities. The ones I'm using right here are Samsung 35Es. These are 3500 milliamp hour cells. They give this thing quite a significant battery life. I have not actually drained it entirely yet, but from what I can tell by playing Final Fantasy V all night, for testing purposes of course, you're probably going to get like anywhere from 12 to 15 hours of battery life through these. It's pretty significant actually, and of course it does take 2, which is awesome. Waveshare's other case that I mentioned earlier, the Game Hat, the one that has the analog stick on it and is more like a PSP form factor, it also uses 18650s, but it only uses 1. Which is still pretty nice because of course it's rechargeable, you don't have to worry about replacing it or anything like that in the short term, but this case using 2 is a really big deal. And I should mention also, by the way, because the instructions for the case don't mention this, these 18650s, the protected ones, the ones with the little nub on top, do not fit. They're about 3 millimeters too long. You need the unprotected batteries, the flat top batteries where both ends look like this. Otherwise, they won't fit. The case itself does have its own charge protection circuitry in there, so you don't have to worry about the batteries getting over-discharged or overcharged or anything still, even though they're unprotected. It has its own chip for that, but just as a little PSA, because like I said, the schematics for the case do not mention this, use unprotected flat top cells or else they will not fit. I found this out the hard way. Now, how does emulation actually work on a Raspberry Pi? What do you actually do? Well, the main thing that you will probably be doing is installing RetroPie, which is a sort of operating environment that is on top of something called Raspbian, which is a Linux-based operating system specifically for the Raspberry Pi, using something called RetroArch, which is also like a sort of operating environment-esque thing that RetroPie actually installs on top of. It's very easy to do. All you really need is something called Etcher. I would recommend a program called Etcher. It allows you to take empty SD cards, format them, and then put on whatever that you want, usually an operating system image. In this case, I will of course link it, like I mentioned, the RetroPie website does in fact have its own images available, and you can just flash that to one of these empty cards, plop it in here, and actually set it up with a keyboard, and you'll be ready to go. It's not that difficult. It doesn't take very much time. And this that you're seeing right now, this little menu here, I can't really get it to focus, is called Emulation Station. This is the sort of layer that is installed on top of RetroPie that actually gives you a graphical environment to select and manage your emulators and ROMs. The interesting thing about Emulation Station is a nice little convenience feature. You may see that I only have a certain number of emulators here. There are actually way more than this that come installed on RetroPie. They simply don't show up in this list until you have actually installed at least one ROM for them to find and play, which is really useful because that means you can still have everything installed without having to scroll past like a dozen or two empty directories just to find the ones that you want. So they only populate this list if you got some for them. How does this actually work with getting ROMs onto it? There are a couple of ways you can do it. You can use things like the Wi-Fi. The 3B Plus actually does have Wi-Fi in it already, so you can simply use that in order to place ROMs, BIOS files, whatever you need onto this directly. You can also use one of these, which is what I've been doing because my Wi-Fi is not all that reliable sometimes, thank you Comcast. This is of course a memory stick. All you have to do is take a memory stick, format it as a FAT32 file structure, because that is what both your Windows, more likely PC, and this Linux system will actually recognize. Then you just make an empty folder on it called RetroPie. And of course, since I mentioned Linux is in fact case sensitive, you need the RetroPie folder to be in all lowercase. Just an empty folder called RetroPie, that's all you need. Then just take this out of your PC, plug it into one of the USB ports on that, wait for a couple seconds, and it will copy the entire folder structure of its emulation system onto this. Now, plug this back into your PC, look at that used to be empty folder, and you will see that it is now filled with all of the emulator folders for the emulators that you have installed. just drag your ROMs into the respective folders for the emulators that they use, plug this back into the RetroPie system, and it will copy them over and you will have your ROMs. It's actually really, really simple. It's a very easy way to do things, and it's very effective. It even works with BIOS files and things like that for emulators that need that. I should also mention that a couple of the emulators that you've seen in that menu and that you're going to see in the background from, the footage I'm putting in here randomly are emulators that don't come with the system, but that you can install. So it is definitely worthwhile to actually, it is definitely worthwhile to actually make something like this because of the extra bits that you can do when it comes to emulating stuff as opposed to simply playing it on original hardware. Sometimes emulators have a bit of a unique experience to them involving stuff like ROM hacks and patches, and it's really cool to just have something that I can just play in my hand, just like chill in bed or whatever, and play Game Boy Advance games, and then switch over to like a PS1 game randomly, and then switch over to a PSP game, and just kind of have some fun that way. It's really cool, and like I mentioned, it is definitely a project that I recommend trying if you have any interest in like hobbyist electronics or emulation or cat hair on your screen or whatever. So that is kind of the overview of my little project, the thing that I have spent some time creating over the Christmas holiday season. And it was very much worth it because it does pretty much everything I wanted it to do, and some stuff like the PSP, it actually runs better than I thought it would. It's surprisingly fast. So yeah, that's just a little overview. Again, there are like some links and stuff for resources in the description below this video, so that if you want to do anything like this, you can get started down there and maybe have a bit of an easier time of it. I hope this is useful to some people. I hope it was interesting at least, and like I said, this is the first time I've ever done any kind of hardware related anything. So yeah, this has been a really nice year for the channel as far as growth goes, so thank you to everyone who's been watching and who's been supporting me throughout this year. It's been a more up-trending year than ever, so thank you very much for that. And I hope you have a really good New Year's, stay safe, and I'll see you guys in 2020.